Good afternoon, everybody. Very warm welcome to you all from everywhere you're joining us from. Kia ora to Kevin in New Zealand. I think you're currently winning for being the furthest away, unless somebody is in Otago, who's slightly further away.
Good to see Sherwood Rangers in the house. Good to see
Sherwood Rangers here too. Hello, Wayne. Hello everybody else. Do keep continuing to tell us where you're from, because
Carl as well. Go on, the SOI. Absolutely, Carl. You better believe it.
It's all, I can let you chat to these guys directly. I don't really do it. I could log off. But Nishant, hi, welcome from India as well. Great to see you too. Thank you for joining us. Do keep continuing to put in where you're from, guys. It's always wonderful to see how far we're reaching. And obviously you've all discovered the question tab. Our Merrin's in as well. Hi, Merrin. You've discovered the question tab too, because those are filling up. Now, I mean, the reason we're here today doesn't need very much introduction. We're here to talk all things D-Day and Normandy with James Holland, the fantastic author, historian, and general all-round whiz when it comes to Second World War history. James and I are going to have a bit of a chat first. We'll talk through a couple of questions, but there'll be plenty of time for you guys to ask your own questions too. So please do continue to use the chat, continue to use the question function, and we'll move from there. Keep an eye out for our little call to action on the bottom too, because there's going to be a couple of things popping up in there that I will direct you to as and when. I'll also say now at the top of the show that James has produced a brand new documentary on Normandy that is available on Vimeo that you can watch from the comfort of your very own home. Not until you finish watching us, of course, but you can feel free to go watch that on Friday afternoon or wait till tomorrow if you can for the anniversary itself. My colleague Nicola will be posting the link to that shortly. But in the meantime, everybody, let's give a huge virtual welcome to James. And we will kick off and start straight away. And I think the obvious question to start with, James, is why does D-Day remain so fascinating to us all?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for this. Obviously, Hollywood is a big part of it. You have The Longest Day, you've got Band of Brothers, you've got, of course, Saving Private Ryan. And Saving Private Ryan came at an interesting time, didn't it? I think it came out in 1999, and it was, no one had ever filmed a battle like that before. Usually up until that point, depictions of the Second World War on screen would be pretty clean. And I think it was a sort of massive kind of sort of realization that actually, when people are hit in the Second World War, they don't just sort of drop cleanly on the floor with no blood. It is a sort of horrible, violent, grotesque sort of business. And I think that put it on the map again, having kind of, not that it had ever gone away. I think the other reason is sort of proximity. You can quite easily get to Normandy. You can see the beaches. You can see the remains of bunkers and stuff. And then I suppose the third reason is just because it is the big pivotal moment. It's the, after Dunkirk, it is the time that the Allies actually return to French soil in force. I mean, obviously, there's been raids before that. There's been smaller forays and all the rest of it, from Saint-Nazaire to Dieppe to all the rest of it. But it's the big one, isn't it? And it is seen as a sort of pivotal moment in the Second World War when suddenly all the hard work of the previous sort of 4 years has come to sort of fruition, and it's this. The war is nearing its kind of end game from this moment onwards, the moment that D-Day is successful. So for all those reasons, the sacrifice of what it represents, the kind of, and also I suppose it's because it's the Americans first. They weren't there in 1940, but they're playing that massive part from kind of 1944 in Northwest Europe almost to the end of the war, and it marks that point as well. And although it's the second front, it is the main effort for the Allies in the West from June 1944 onwards. And it's because of its multifaceted nature of airborne drops, of landing craft, of warships, of typhoons and thunderbolts and all the rest of it, and bombers. It's and it's got Waffen-SS, and it's got Rommel, and it's got Patton, and it's got Monty, and it's got all these sort of familiar names. So I think it's add that all together, and that's why it's so important.
I think there's lots of stuff in there we're going to pick up and elaborate on later as well. But so I mean, when we look at the landings itself, people often associate D-Day and Normandy with being sort of the only real amphibious operation that the British and the Allies operate, and yet actually, there's plenty more. I mean, what have the Allies actually learned from some of these previous landings? It's not actually, D-Day is not even the first time they try and land in Normandy, is it? I mean, so, the lessons of Sicily, of Anzio, the failures of Dieppe, how had they been incorporated into the Allied planning for Normandy in June 44?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I mean, Operation Torch is the first big test. I think you can sort of largely discount Dieppe. I mean, what Dieppe does in August 1940 tells you that you can't really attack a port in northwest France. You know, attacking a port is just going to be too hard. One of the big problems also is there's not enough beaches on that stretch of the coast. It's also cliffs, which then go down to these little narrow fissures where rivers cut through the rock, and that's where you have your port. And they're just too easily defended. So that's the lesson from there. Torch is the first sort of major amphibious operation. It involves 3 invasion forces going separately 1,000 and 3,000 miles, and they all 3 invasion forces sort of roughly land where they should at roughly the right time and in the right place. And it's an amazing undertaking. It's the first kind of joint operation where you've got a joint planning team across tri-service planning team, international planning team of coalition partners, predominantly British and American, but also others involved as well. And so that's a big testing ground. I think the really big one is Sicily. And one of the problems with Sicily, Operation Husky, which was launched on the 10th of July 1943, is that all the senior command and the planning is taking place while they're still fighting the Tunisia campaign. And there's been much criticism about the Allied planning operations, the fact that it went through these sort of 9 different drafts, and no one seemed to be able to make their mind up and all the rest of it. I mean, Case Yellow, which was the German assault on the West and launched on the 10th of May 1940, also went through a number of different gestation periods, and no one seems to criticise them for that. But I think the real lesson from it was that all the key players, from Monty to Alexander to Eisenhower to Patton and Bradley, all the not to mention the air commanders, Tedder, Spots, Cunningham, Doolittle, and so on. They're all involved with the Tunisia campaign from January through to 13th of May when the Tunisia campaign is over. And the planning, the final plan for Operation Husky is finally agreed on the 2nd of May. And there is a sense that you can't really do 2 things at once. So although the Salerno landings in Sicily happen later, at least Mark Clark has been given kind of free rein to kind of plan that on his own, unencumbered by the Sicilian campaign. And what they decide for Overlord on the back of what has happened with Husky is that you need your commanders and your planning team completely separate from anything else, which is why Montgomery, Eisenhower, and various others are all withdrawn from the Italian theatre at the end of December 1943 and sent back to England specifically to plan for D-Day 5 months and then 6 months hence, as it finally turns out. And I think those are the kind of the major lessons. There's other smaller lessons, which is don't have divisions too far apart, which is one of the, your landing forces too far apart so that they are always mutually supporting, which is a sort of a lesson learned from Salerno, where the attacking forces of Fifth Army are just a bit too far apart and they can't quite support each other mutually in a way that Clark would have liked them to. And that's a lesson learned. So there are lots of small things. There's other really interesting things. So, for example, Miles Dempsey is commander of 13 Corps on the 10th of July 1943, and one of his D-Day objectives is Syracusa. The Syracusa is 10 miles from the invasion beaches. Fast forward 11 months, he's now commander of 2nd Army. One of his D-Day objectives is the city of Caen, which is 10 miles from the invasion beaches. Now, on D-Day, 6th of June 1944, that's at the outer reach of what can be achieved, but there is still some precedence there. So you can there's lots, particularly from Sicily, more from Anzio, because Sicily is a much bigger operation, where there are lessons learned. The other big lesson that has been learned is that you have to have air superiority, air supremacy over the actual invasion beaches, and air superiority over a vast tract of land as an absolute cast iron prerequisite before you attempt any invasion. You've got to win the deception picture. You've got to keep the enemy guessing as to where and when you're going to land. And that is successfully done at both Salerno and for Husky as well. So these are all things that are really being picked up on before Overlord and Neptune.
I mean, would you say then that by the time it comes to Overlord, this is actually a well-practiced and oiled machine, and yes, there's always going to be friction and there's always going to be risk involved in military operations, but actually by this stage the Allies pretty much know what they're doing, and they can apply to this?
Yeah, there's two big considerations that don't face them beforehand, and that is that the opposition in northwest France is going to be far greater than it was in Italy or indeed Sicily, and certainly far greater than it was in northwest Africa, which at the time was where the Allies were just being opposed by Vichy French forces, and actually a deal had already been done beforehand that they would kind of sort of make a kind of show of defending and then throwing the towel. So, you know, that was a kind of surefire victory, torch wars. The defences are more formidable in northwest Europe, in Normandy. The minefields out at sea are far denser, which is a massive undertaking that's got to be sorted out. The complexities of getting such a huge amount of material from England to northern France is also more complex, I think, than the others. I mean, you know, the distances for Sicily and Anzio are far greater, but than they were for Normandy, but or certainly for Sicily. But actually, it's a much more complex operation. Although more men are actually landed on D-Day on Sicily in July 1943, in terms of naval vessels, air forces, coordinating all that, it is a much, much, much more complex operation. So the challenges are still absolutely huge. But the biggest problem is that, you know, you're up against sort of, you know, 70 odd divisions rather than, you know, a handful of German divisions.
So, I mean, maybe we'll pick up on the German defenders in just a moment. But, I mean, really, when it came to sort of choosing where the second, I mean, we always refer to Normandy as the second front, don't we, which sort of neglects Italy a little bit. But from a political perspective, in particular from what Stalin wanted, this was going to be the second front.
Yeah.
In comparison to Normandy, I mean, was Normandy pretty much the only option? Was it the best of bad options? Could they have gone anywhere else? I mean, what kind of what was evaluated and discarded throughout this planning process?
Well, actually, it's Mountbatten who suggests Normandy when he is commander of combined operations, which is this sort of joint services sort of, I suppose it's a sort of glorified raiding operation, really. But because of the work they've been doing, he comes up with the Normandy idea. There's actually comparatively few places you could do it. You could do it in Holland, but you've got an awful lot of water to sort of get around. You know, it's very low level. It's easy to flood. You know, so that poses all sorts of problems. And also the Atlantic Wall there is quite strong. Then you've got the Pas-de-Calais, where the Atlantic Wall is at its strongest. And what we're talking about the Atlantic Wall, we're not talking about kind of, you know, a solid kind of Trump-esque wall between Mexico and the United States or the Great Wall of China or anything. What we're talking about is a series of interconnected defenses. So mines, beach obstacles, bunkers, machine gun posts, heavy artillery guns, you know, coastal guns, all that kind of stuff. So it's a sort of, you know, it's a mixture. Then you go down, and then you've got sort of either side of the River Seine, which is possible because there are beaches there. But then you've got this whole issue of cliffs. There's quite a lot of cliffs around Le Havre and Saint Valery and up to Dieppe and so on. So there's not a lot of beaches. And then you get to Normandy, where there are a lot of really nice beaches. The Cherbourg, obviously, Peninsula, which is where actually the British didn't. Well, they landed back in June 1940 when they re-invaded, sent over the second BEF, which everyone forgets about. Then you've got Brittany, which has got lots of beaches, but also got lots of craggy coastline and cliffs and stuff, which is a bit problematic. And also, it's a little bit too far. You know, you need to be within range of fighter cover. You know, that is really, really important. Air cover is absolutely essential. We can talk about why air power is so essential in a minute. So in a way, you know, the options are kind of narrowing. I mean, there was a sort of plans to do a sort of concurrent and then a staggered invasion of southern France, which eventually happens on 15th of August, Operation Dragoon, which is originally called Operation Anvil, in the south of France. But again, you know, where's your kind of support base for that? You wouldn't want that to be the main invasion. Further down south of Brittany, you've got lots and lots of beaches, but it's just too far. It's too far from any base. I mean, what's amazing is that the Germans don't tweak this. I mean, Rommel is the one who gets closest because he thinks that it's going to probably happen either side of the Seine estuary. And that's a pretty good bet. But actually, if the Germans were really thinking clearly and actually sat down and thought about it properly, you could probably work out you could have a pretty good bet where the Allies are likely to land, because you're not going to be in the Pas-de-Calais because it's so strong. And other than the Pas-de-Calais, there's not really that many options, really. I mean, the Germans even sort of thought about maybe the Allies might land in Norway, but really, I mean, there's no beaches in Norway really worth talking about. It's an incredibly difficult place to launch a major invasion. So it sort of lends itself to Normandy because you've got these big beaches. And the reason you want big beaches and with very long tides is because, very deep beaches, is so that you can land lots of stuff, because you've already realized from the Dieppe raid that attacking a port isn't going to work. So if you haven't got a port, then you need to kind of either bring the port to Normandy or create a situation where you can actually land lots of material on beaches. And there's precedent for this in the Pacific, where there's no ports on any of those Pacific atolls, and also in Sicily, where the Americans particularly were, and the British to a certain extent to start off with, were landing the vast majority of their material straight onto beaches from the combination of landing ships and ducks and so on.
And I mean, you mentioned the German defenders there, and when we look at the sheer weight of things, of material that the Allies are able to flood across the Channel and start pouring into the beaches, once the Allies get ashore on the 6th of June, is that pretty much it? I mean, at what point are the Germans going to be able to? Are the Germans going to be able to throw them back? Are they going to, or is it pretty much all the campaign for Normandy and northern France is pretty much lost from the fact that by midnight on the 6th of June, the Allies are ashore and still ashore?
Okay, well, can I just sort of go back a step on that, which is, I am going to answer your point. But yes, the Allies have got vast amounts of material, but it's all stuck in southern England. You've got this big problem that you've got to get across the Channel, which is sort of variously kind of sort of 80 to 100 miles across, depending on the zigzag you've got to get through minefields and the parts of the coastline you've got to get to and where you're coming from in the first place. So it's kind of 80 to 100 miles that you've got to travel in a ship which is doing kind of 10 to 14 knots on a good day. So it takes time to get across. The problem you've got is not once. So basically, the moment you land, the race is on. Who can build up the most material quickly and decisively into the bridgehead? Is it going to be the Allies who've got this incredibly long distance they've got to travel by sea, which is slow, or is it going to be the Germans who are already in France and they've just got to get from A to B across country? And that is the big challenge, and that is not going to be resolved on D-Day or even D+1 or D+2, but we're talking D+7 or 8, and in actual fact, the last chance that the Germans have doesn't go till probably the 1st of July, I would say. That is the last possible chance. Obviously, every day that passes, the opportunities are receding, but that is the last chance that they have. And again, I can go on to that and explain why in a minute. So the whole build-up to D-Day, you've got this challenge. This is your conundrum. How do you get your vast millions? That in England, you've built up overwhelming material that can beat that is invincible. The Germans simply do not have the ability to beat that amount of massed material that the Allies have. The problem is, how quickly can you get it to Normandy to make it a decisive amount of build-up? And so the moment you land, there is this race. So what the Allies have got to do, a big part of D-Day happens before D-Day happens, which is to kind of try and slow down the Germans and make it as difficult as possible for the Germans to actually get to Normandy and reinforce that bridgehead and knock the Allies back into the sea with a massed, armoured, mobile counterattack. And that is where the danger really lies. So the idea of the Atlantic Wall is to kind of is actually exactly the same policy that the French had in 1940. So the idea that the French have in 1940 is when the Germans attack, the infantry divisions along the defensive perimeter, whether that be the River Meuse or wherever it might be, or the Maginot Line, it stops the German attack long enough for the mobile reserves to concentrate and come up and kick the Germans back into Germany. That's the plan for the French in 1940. The German plan in 1944 is exactly the same. So the Atlantic Wall is supposed to be an immediate buffer to stop the Allies or anyone getting onto French soil, while the mobile divisions, which are your real kind of fighting elite, can reinforce the bridgehead, mass together in a coordinated counterattack and push the Allies back into the sea. So to do this, the Germans have available around 10 mobile divisions. And most of them are called Panzer divisions. There's the 17th Panzer Grenadier Division. But what we're talking about here is combined arms mobile units. A Panzer division is not a division that is stuffed full of panzers, i.e. tanks. It is an all-arms combination of motorized infantry, motorized artillery, anti-tank artillery, and of course tanks themselves and armored fighting vehicles. And so you want to get those there as quickly as possible. So there's two ways you do this. First of it is by deception and by intelligence, which is to keep the Germans guessing as to where the main attack is going to be. And that is why it is so important that the Germans never discover where or when precisely it's going to be. Keep them guessing. And that way, you're encouraging the Germans to keep their panzer divisions, these mobile divisions, spread all over the place, trying to kind of sort of answer any available kind of sort of eventuality to do with the Allied invasion. The second way you do this is to destroy the German means of communication. So lines of communication and the actual radio communication as well. So how do you do this? Well, first of all, you've got to clear the skies of the Luftwaffe. So you've got to dominate those skies. And the reason you do that is because the people that are going to do the hard yards of blowing up bridges, roads, marshalling yards, all the rest of it, are going to be comparatively low-level bombers for the most part. We're talking media bombers, twin-engine Mitchells and Marauders and so on, that are going to come in at comparatively low level, a matter of a few thousand feet, and destroy a bridge, which requires really accurate bombing to do that. And you're going to augment that with fighter bombers. So single engine fighters are going to come over with rockets and 500-pound bombs strung under their wings, and cannons, and shoot up stuff. And so you have to, first of all, win that air superiority over Northwest France. So that has been achieved by middle of April 1944. And then you need a concentrated air campaign to actually do the damage itself. And that is undertaken. And by the beginning of June 1944, just unbelievable levels of bombing have been carried out on France alone, but also in Germany and Holland and Belgium and all the rest of it. So all the bridges across the River Seine have been destroyed. Most of the bridges across the Loire have been destroyed. Roads have been shot up. Marshalling yards have been destroyed. And this is really important because the Reichsbahn is the German lifeline. This is the glue that keeps the German war effort together. You know, they don't have much oil, so they don't have much petrol fuel, which means their mechanized power is really limited. What they do have a fair amount of is coal, and coal fires train locomotives and railways, which is why they're so dependent on the railway network. So obviously, if you can come over a major marshalling yard like Ham, which is a big sort of nodal point confluence of railways for the Germans moving troops and material back and forth across the Reich, and you can destroy that and knock out lots of railway lines and sidings and plant, then obviously that is a good thing. Where are the other big marshalling yards? Orléans, Lille, all the industrial north, Le Mans. You know, you work out where those panzer divisions are, and you make sure that their ability to reach Normandy from wherever they are is massively curtailed. So, you know, there's a load of panzer divisions in the south near Limoges, so that's a major thoroughfare going north to Normandy in terms of railway and in terms of roads. So you destroy those. You destroy anything coming from the west, from the east rather, from Germany itself, from the Paris area, from the northern France. All those lines you kind of try and destroy as much as you possibly can. Then you've got a whole chain of radar chains. I mean, if you go back to 1940, you know, Goering decides to attack the British radar stations on the 12th of August, just the day before Eagle Day, the main all-out Luftwaffe's offensive against the RAF. It's not very effective, and then he just thinks, oh, well, sod that, you know, let's not bother with it anymore. And that's the end of it. And so for the whole of the Battle of Britain, Britain has its eyes and ears and is able to see when the enemy's coming, which means it can get off the ground and not be flying around when the Luftwaffe not be on the ground when the Luftwaffe turn up, which means it makes the Luftwaffe's job 100 times more difficult than it was trying to destroy the French Army of the Air and the RAF in France back in May and June. Because at that point, there was no air defense system over France. So we know in reverse the importance of knocking out their ability to predict when we're coming. So, you know, in the run up to D-Day, 76 of the 92 radar stations on the Atlantic Wall are knocked out, destroyed, and the radar chain is down to 5% effectiveness. So it's basically been, to all intents and purposes, completely gone. That means that when you go over to Normandy on D-Day itself, with your intelligence effort, your deception plans, the fake news, the kind of, Juan Pujol, Agent Garbo, the listening service, the work of Bletchley, the dummy armies, the United States First Army Group, the dummy army group that doesn't exist, all the rest of it, you've kept the Germans guessing as to where and when you're going to land. But in addition to that, you command the skies. And that means your job of then maintaining, of doing that build-up of material and winning that battle is so much greater. And one of the top priorities once you come over is not just bringing over men and tanks and machine guns and artillery pieces, it's also bringing over bulldozers and graders and PSP. And within, I think it is by the 12th of June, so 6 days on, there are 5 airfields in Normandy. And by the 20th of June, so 2 weeks on, there are 12 airfields in Normandy. That is absolutely going some. The first airfield is operational just about by the evening of D+1, the 7th of June, and it's right behind Omaha Beach on the bluffs there, at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. It's an absolutely incredible achievement. And of course, what that means is that your fighter bombers, your ground attack aircraft, can then be operating from Normandy rather than from southern England, which means they haven't got to waste lots of time going back and forth to refuel and rearm, which is a huge part of your fuel costs, which means you've got more time over the combat zone, which means you've got more time to maraud inland and hammer everything that moves. And of course, the beauty about it being in June rather than in early May is that the days are longer, which means the hours of darkness are shorter, which makes it even harder for the Germans to reinforce the front. So obviously, in terms of winning the eventual battle, the most important thing on D-Day is that it doesn't fail. That trumps any D-Day objective. The number one primo objective is to get there, unload stuff, secure the flanks, join up the 5 invasion beaches as quickly as you possibly can, secure those nodal points that you need to secure, and then move forward, move southwards in a sort of rough kind of line of togetherness. And actually, landing successfully on D-Day is a massive tick in the box, but you're not out of the woods yet. You're starting to kind of win that battle for the build-up by certainly D+14, and it is all over for sure by the 1st of July. And the reason it's all over by the 1st of July is because lots and lots of these panzer units are struggling to get up to Normandy. They haven't found it easy because of all that work that's been done by air power beforehand, and it's been continued to be carried out after D-Day. But what happens is on the 26th of June, Operation Epsom is launched around the Caen area, and the panzer divisions are being drawn to that Caen area like a magnet, like a sort of moth to a light, because that is the key, that is the hinge from which the Allies would then sweep eastwards towards Germany and towards the rest of France. So obviously that is where the Germans are going to concentrate the most of their effort. And unfortunately for the Germans, as these panzer divisions are arriving into the theatre, sort of, first there's one there, the 21st Panzer Division, then the 12th Waffen-SS hit the Jugend Division comes, then the Panzer Lehr, then more the 2nd, the 10th, the 1st SS, the 9th SS, I think it is. As they start arriving into theatre, they haven't got time to kind of organise themselves, get the lay of the land. They're new to this territory too. They're just thrown into counterattacking against the British operation at Epsom. And what that means is they're just being attrited before they can coordinate a proper coordinated counterattack. And by the 1st of July, it is clear that that opportunity to mount that coordinated counterattack has gone, and therefore they're going to lose the campaign in Normandy and within the whole of France.
I mean, you talked about it quite a lot there, actually. And, when we do talk about D-Day, we talk about D-Day in Normandy, but we often don't talk about the rest of what Normandy involves. And those campaigns, if it's not about D-Day, if it's not about Pegasus Bridge, maybe it's Carentan because people have seen Band of Brothers, or Merville if you look to the eastern flanks. But for the rest of that campaign, I mean, what does really you sort of elaborated on a little bit there, but what are those key milestones in those battles, those small operations that take place in the drive out of the bridgehead that are able, I mean, the Allies can wear down the Germans, disrupt them before they can mass for any kind of significant counterattack, which is what they're constantly trying to do. But also just keep the momentum building and keep flooding the area of supplies. You know, you mentioned Epsom there, but I mean, what are the other sort of the key moments there that I think people perhaps need to look at in a bit closer detail?
Yeah, well, I think you can divide the whole battle into 5 phases. So the first phase we've touched on, which is the kind of air battle before it's launch. The second phase is D-Day itself, just getting across, you know, landing, making sure that is successful, that there aren't any kind of major setbacks. Then the third phase is the kind of immediate build-up, the joining up of the bridgehead. So what do I mean by bridgehead? Well, what you've got is you've got these little pockets around the landing beaches where the Allies are kind of sort of pushing inland, and it's sort of a slightly sort of jagged line. And what you want is for everyone to join up so that it is, you know, the Allies have complete control of a swathe of the coastline, which goes from sort of Utah Beach at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, which is this bit that sort of sticks around at sort of 90 degrees to the kind of north-facing main Normandy coastline. Those flanks are secure, and you can then start moving southwards. And then the fourth phase is that attritional phase where you're sort of pushing slowly. The Germans are reinforcing, and you've got this sort of attritional period where the front line isn't moving a huge amount, but quite a lot is actually happening in terms of attrition and grinding down the enemy's effort. You know, this is where the two forces are sort of going like this, and sort of, you know, the Allies are sort of pushing them back, but very slowly. You know, on a map it doesn't look terribly dramatic, but actually it's more dramatic than yes, the map kind of movement would suggest. And then you've got the final phase, which is the breakout, which is when the German defences collapse. Now, the pre-battle assumption is that that fourth phase is going to be much more staggered, that the Germans are going to retreat in phases. And the reason the Allies think this is because that is what the Germans have done in the past. It's what they've done in Tunisia. It's what they've done in Sicily. It's what they've done in southern Italy. And you don't really have any other guess other than precedence. And also because it makes no sense militarily to fight close to the coastline once the Atlantic Wall has been breached. Because if you fight close to the coastline, then the Germans are going to be within range of offshore naval guns, which is a whole another layer of enemy, i.e. Allied firepower, that they're going to have to contend with, that they wouldn't do if they, you know, relinquished a bit of land and kind of took their time and kind of moved backwards. So that is why there is this assumption beforehand that actually it's going to move inland quite swiftly. They're going to get the Burgos Ridge, which lies to the kind of sort of south east of Caen, and where there's a very obvious place for making landing grounds very quickly. And they'll, you know, by D+17, they'll be kind of sort of 50 miles inland. It's not an unreasonable premise and supposition. It doesn't happen that way because Hitler denies his generals the chance to retreat. You know, they are constantly going, mein Führer, you know, we think it would be best to kind of retreat to the Seine line. It would be good idea to kind of retreat 50 miles or whatever. And Hitler just says, no, you're not going to do that. I want you to fight as close to the front as you possibly can for as long as you possibly can. One of the reasons he does that is because the land in Normandy is of far greater strategic importance than it is in Tunisia or even southern Italy, because there you can prosecute the war in all its different facets. You know, this is the one chance in Normandy where, you know, once the Atlantic coastline is gone, there will be no opportunity for the Germans to really bring the exciting new Type 21 U-boats to bear. It's still a pipe dream by 1944. It isn't going to happen. But Hitler doesn't know that at that point. You know, he still believes that there is a chance. Once it's gone, once those U-boat bases have gone, they've gone. And that is it. So Normandy is of far greater strategic importance to Hitler than other places. And that's why he's so reluctant to kind of give an inch. But it doesn't help the Germans, and it doesn't help the German defenders to have a kind of long drawn, you know, it means that the battle is going to be over quicker. For the Allies, though, looking at this, you think, you know, what the heck? You know, you've got all these tanks, you've got all this firepower, you've got all this naval support, you've got all this airport, and you can't even break through. But the Allies are up against unbelievably difficult environment in which to attack. And actually, there's a very interesting case, which is the 7th of June, where the Canadians are advancing inland. There's a couple of infantry battalions supported by a handful of Sherman tanks from the Sherman Fusiliers, and they come up against the full weight of the leading panzer regiment of the 12th Hitlerjugend Waffen-SS division, Panzer Division, who are full of bristling with weaponry, are fresh to battle, are gung-ho, are highly disciplined and pretty decently trained and fanatical and all those kind of things, which makes them a pretty kind of formidable opposition. When they attack the Canadians, they basically get nowhere. They move about 1.5 miles that day and can get no further. Now, by the afternoon, it's true that Canadian artillery is brought into bear and all the rest of it, but they get absolutely nowhere. And that tells you a number of things, but what it really tells me is that attacking anywhere in Normandy is an incredibly difficult proposition. With a really good, highly equipped, highly motivated Waffen-SS Panzer Division can't make much headway, what chance do the Allies have? And I think it's important to kind of put that attritional period into some kind of perspective here. When you're coming up, in the area that the British Canadians are, the landscape around Caen and all there, it's really open farmland. I mean, you've been there, Peter. You know what it's all about. I mean, it's big kind of sort of rolling, narrow ridge lines rising to kind of sort of comparatively narrow hill, shallow hills. Then there's a slightly plunging river valley or something. But there's lots of places and lots of woods. So there's lots of places to hide anti-tank guns, field artillery, panzers, and so on. But to get to them, the infantry have got to advance over kind of very exposing land, because obviously the good places to be hidden have already been bagged by the Germans in their defences. But to take them, you've got to kind of get across that field with your armour and your infantry, and it's not so very different from the Western Front in 1914 to 1918. Moving further west, you've then got the bocage. Well, the bocage is also an absolute nightmare because you've got all these little fields with these hedgerows, and the Shermans can't burst through because the hedges are actually built onto pre-existing kind of early medieval mounds, which makes it very difficult for them to get through. And what you really want is infantry and armour to operate together, and they just can't in the best way. Meanwhile, in these small fields at the far side, infantry can hide with their machine guns, and the next field beyond can hide with their mortars. And it gives the Germans a very kind of flexible defence, which of course they don't have with their concrete, which is incredibly rigid, actually on the crust of the Atlantic wall itself. So that's also an incredibly difficult place in which to fight. And the only way you're going to do this is by sheer weight of firepower, or by having that stick, that carrot of pushing forward infantry and armour. It's going to hurt. They're going to take casualties, but that is how you're going to get the Germans to counterattack, which is exactly what happens at Operation Epsom. So British push forward, make a certain amount of ground, 5 miles or something like that. Then the Germans start pouring in these Panzer Division units as they're reaching the battlefront. And of course, they're not just reaching in one whole, they're reaching in individual units. They're flung into it. And as they counterattack, of course, they are then having to expose themselves in turn. They're having to move out of their sheltered wood. They're having to kind of move out of their foxholes, out of that camouflaged hedge, and cross these open fields themselves. And at that point, the British have considerably more firepower that they can bring to bear than the Germans ever do. And of course, they're absolutely decimated. But because Hitler is saying, no, you've got to stay at the front and you've got to fight for every yard, until they're absolutely broken, they're not going to give way, or not going to give way to any great extent, which is why you have this long period of building up of material, of attritional, where it's just this sort of awful grind pushing forward. But at the moment that the floodgates open, then suddenly you've got this huge surge ahead, and that happens not with any of the British operations. It doesn't happen with Operation Epsom. It doesn't happen with Goodwood or Jupiter or any of these operations that are happening in the British sector. It finally happens in the American sector. Operation Cobra, which finally launched once and for all on the 25th of July 1944, just to the kind of northwest of the city of Saint-Lô. And that is where the big breakthrough happens. And the German positions there just completely break. But that is because they've already been attrited. They've already been chewed up to such an extent that they physically can no longer hold the line. And at that point, the Americans burst through with all their material strength and their mechanization. They're able to push through. And of course, the great advantage is suddenly the Germans are having to retreat in daylight, which means the Allied air forces, which are now even stronger than they were at the beginning of June, because there's even more airfields, those fighter bombers can just harry them every single step of the way. And that's why thereafter, it's only a matter of weeks before the whole shooting match is over.
I mean, and obviously with the German retreat, and we talk about things like Fallace and that sort of stuff, and the closing of Fallace Gap. Although interestingly, is there possibly a bit of criticism from Montgomery here, who maybe is a bit too proud about letting the Americans sweep round behind them and cross into the British sector and actually fully closing that and really trapping what's left of the German resources in there, rather than letting them escape and perhaps fight another day. I mean, could Normandy, do you think, have been a more complete victory than perhaps it turned out to be?
I don't think so, really. I mean, I suppose, with hindsight, one can always say, you might have closed that gap a little bit sooner. But I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen it. I mean, you will have seen pictures, but I don't know if everyone else has seen pictures of the Fallace Gap. I mean, it's a pretty desperate place to be. I mean, what are we talking about? 2,500 armored fighting vehicles the Germans bring into the theatre. Barely 24 get away. 50,000 men escape, perhaps, out of 2 complete armies. I mean, it's not. That's a pretty catastrophic defeat, whichever way you look at it. And obviously, those 50,000 and those 24 armored fighting vehicles, they're in no position to kind of fight at all in the next month or so. And that's why you have the Rückmarsch, the big retreat, and you have this kind of sort of staggeringly swift operation that follows. I mean, what you have to understand is that there's always a balance, between speed of operations and saving lives. So obviously the Western Allies, what they want to do is they want to win as quickly as they possibly can, but they also want to have the least amount of casualties as they possibly can. And that's a tricky balance, because obviously if you're too cautious, it's going to take longer, which ultimately is going to cost more lives. But if you're too reckless with your men's lives, then your losses are going to be greater. I mean, to me, it's no accident that General Patton, who commands Third Army from the 1st of August 1944 onwards in the theatre, in the Normandy theatre, Third Army is the army that has the greatest number of casualties in Northwest Europe, and yet that is the one that has the most tactical drive. That is the one that has the most tactical chutzpah and moves the fastest. But there is a cost, and Britain has a very, very difficult role to play, because it wants to maintain the way of war in which it's been very successful in the Second World War, which is to use vast amounts of firepower and to use steel, not flesh, as much as it possibly can, and to use and that means to use mechanization, global reach, technology, all the rest of it, to do a lot of the hard yards. And that means maintaining quite a lot of your manpower in factories and coal mines and back at base, and shipping, and all the rest of it, which means the amount of people that you can fling into the army is limited. The other thing is the way they've set it up is to have this incredibly long tail. It's what I call big war. And what that also means is that your number of men at the cold face of war is comparatively limited. So, Second Army, for example, I think 14% are infantry, 8% are in tanks, 43% the service corps. And so what the British want to do is maintain that balance. They don't want to suddenly do what the Germans have to do in the summer of 1941, which is take lots of people out of factories and put them into the front line and then fill the factories with slave workers. That isn't an option for us, and we don't want to fight that way. We don't want to fight an infantry-heavy war, because that's a very inefficient way of fighting, because that leads to more casualties. So to maintain our way of war means we have to be very judicious with the manpower we've got. So yes, Monty could have. I mean, a classic example is the Canadian attack on Operation Totalize. So it was very carefully coordinated with air power and actually used of strategic air power to do a key bit of bombing. Now, as it happened, the initial part of Totalize was so successful, they could have pushed on through without the second part of the strategic air bombing mission, because they then spent a kind of 10 hours twiddling their thumbs waiting for the strategic air forces to come over. Now, could you have cancelled that? Possibly, but it's kind of, it's in the plan. It's been arranged. Coordinating this stuff takes time. That is why sometimes the Allies get criticised for being slow. But that's because they've got more to organise, and it takes more to organise. It's not a question of just having a WhatsApp group or kind of sending a few emails around. It is quite a process. And so there is definitely an opportunity missed, but whether that was the wrong decision is, if it was the wrong decision, it's only a wrong decision with hindsight.
Yes.
And hindsight obviously is a brilliant thing. So perhaps they could have been a bit more bullish in those kind of final days in the middle of August and pushed harder going down, but it would have come at a cost. It would have cost more men's lives. And that is the juggle that the British particularly are always having to kind of balance. And I think Monty, for all the criticisms of Monty, I think the one thing he is very, very good at is an operational commander. He understands what this largely conscript army can do. He understands the limitations, and he understands the vast political pressure on him to make sure that Britain still has a seat at the end of the war without having exhausted all its manpower. And to do that, they need to be at the front line. They still need to have, they need to be there when victory is announced. They need to be playing an active part in the front. And that means very, very judicious handling of your manpower. And it means taking calculated risk, but it means not taking reckless risk.
Yeah, and it often is not a lack of offensive spirit, which is often the allegation
Absolutely.
that seems to get thrown about. James, I just have one last question, then I'm going to throw them open to the floor because they're racking up. And actually, this brings us up to the present day. Do you have a favourite place to visit in Normandy? I don't mean to make anyone feel bad that we can't go outside and can't go anywhere right now. I myself was actually supposed to be going to Normandy on holiday this summer, so this is my way of living it sort of vicariously. But do you have a favourite place to visit?
Well, there's so many. I mean, the one of the most beautiful bits is the Fallace Gap. It's absolutely gorgeous. There's a really good if you're a Brit, then a good one to do is to follow the course of Bluecoat, which sort of Operation Bluecoat launched at the very end of July 1944, and you can go from Comont, which is sort of roughly in the middle of the bridgehead line, kind of 20 miles inland, and follow it all down. You go to Montpinçon and onto Fontaine, and you end up in the Fallace Gap. And you can end up round there in the kind of sort of the Dives Valley, or around sort of Laurent-sur-Dives and all around there, and it's just so beautiful. And you end up at sort of Mont-Ormel, which is kind of one of the final bits of fighting where the Poles, the Polish armoured division, were kind of involved, and that's a really good little road trip. Beautiful countryside, amazing food, amazing wine, amazing cheeses. And fantastic history. Mortain is also really, really good to look at. I've just been to the beaches so many times that they're always amazing to go and visit. But it is wonderful to go into the Bocage as well. All that area around Saint-Lô, Hill 192, and all that kind of stuff. It's just endlessly fascinating, I think. So lots of places really. So that's a bit of a kind of sort of bit of a cop out, isn't it?
Right. We'll jump into the questions now then. The first question is from Gareth Davis, who actually, this takes us back to before D-Day, much as you were saying in sort of that opening phase of the battle, and talk about Operation Tiger. And he's asked about whether what happened there in April 44 affected the execution and planning of D-Day.
No, not really. It just made them realise that the jeopardy levels of actually venturing out into the sea. I mean, for those who don't know, this is where the sort of S-boats turn up and kind of sort of hammer some landing exercises for the 4th Infantry, US 4th Infantry, and yeah, it just makes it. I think that's the biggest lesson. The lesson is until they safely get there to the other side, there is lots and lots of things that can still go wrong. It's so complex. There's so many strands to it. There's so many things that can go wrong, from the weather, from intelligence breaches, from running into minefields that haven't been successfully cleared out at sea. It is not a done deal. I mean, what the Allies are doing is launching D-Day to give themselves the best possible chance they can with the material and supplies they've got.
Can I, Rob has asked about the eastern flank and whether it's sort of one of the more forgotten aspects, where the troops seem to be a bit more static. Rob's question is about what problems those guys encountered, sort of while they were trying to hold that, what they were going to do when they were there, when they got relieved, that sort of thing. I've always been very struck by the fact the Ox and Bucks and John Howard, who we know so famously goes into Pegasus Bridge. They then go up into the line up there and suffer horrendous casualty rate. I think he's pretty much the only officer left by the time they come out of the line after a couple of weeks. Perhaps you could tell people a bit more about that.
Yeah, so the eastern flank operation for D-Day and beyond is a quite complicated one, because what you've got running roughly north to south is the Orne Canal, the Con Canal and the River Orne, which run side by side with one another. And the two bridges there have to be captured intact, which is the kind of Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge, and that's the famous John Howard bit where they're capturing those bridges. Then there is this ridge of high ground, which is called the Breville Ridge. Beyond that, another kind of sort of handful of miles, 3 or 4 miles, is another river, the River Deve. The River Deve has sort of been flooded around there, and part of the D-Day operation is to destroy all those bridges. There's 5 bridges. So what you want to do is get access to the high ground along the Breville Ridge by keeping those bridges open, but deny the enemy the chance to get to the high ground from the east. So in other words, destroy those bridges beyond so that you can sit pretty on that high ground. And actually the airborne operation, the British airborne operation, for all the kind of fiasco and chaos that ensues, they achieve all their objectives. Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge remain open. All the 5 bridges at Traun and Bure and Roberholm and elsewhere, they're all destroyed across the River Deve. And the airborne troops are able to get onto the Breville Ridge and occupy it. They are then reinforced by the end of D-Day by those commandos coming from Sword Beach and crossing those bridges, Pegasus and Horsa, which have been kept over by John Howard and co. And the other British paratroopers. They are then that Breville Ridge is then subsequently reinforced by the Black Watch from the 51st Highland Division and various other units. And they are then told to just hold firm. And they don't really move until the 14th of August. It is First World War trench stuff. So they're all dug in. And the Germans are kind of eventually kind of having made their way across these broken bridges and flooded rivers and all the rest of it. They're trying to attack as well. But the main point is that it's the eastern flank, and it is a blocking position to prevent the German 15th Army from sweeping in from the flanks from the kind of northeast, because the Normandy coastline then swerves around again to the kind of the northeast, up from Le Havre and the other side of the Seine estuary and all the rest of it. And that's where the German 15th Army is. So that's the point of that. And of course, you're using paratroopers and commandos in completely the wrong role. That is not what they're designed to do. They are coup de main operators. They're kind of in and out, hold a bit of ground, wait to be relieved, get out of there again. But that is another issue of manpower, and we've got these airborne divisions. They've done their bit there, and they are reinforced, of course, with ammunition and supplies and all the rest of it. But that is not their main role, and they are doing it. And the Ox and Bucks, as you rightly say, get decimated, as do the commandos, as do the paratroopers. I mean, it is a really, really tough fight, and they lose. Within a matter of days, they've lost 1,000 troops in Brigadier Hill's, just his 3rd Parachute Brigade.
Leif Erikson has asked about intelligence, and specifically German intelligence. You mentioned, the use of deception by the Allies in the run-up to this. Leif's asked us about whether the German intelligence organizations were cooperating, and whether there was a failure of cooperation that led to basically diminishing their ability to respond to the Allies.
Oh, yeah, I think there is. I think that's the big problem. It's not that they haven't got intelligence people, and they haven't got good people. The problem is that in the Nazi state, intelligence is power. So you have all these different intelligence units, and they're there's this part of this kind of sort of divide and rule thing. I mean, this is what General James Mattis was talking about yesterday. He was saying what Trump is doing is this kind of divide and rule. It's constantly dividing people rather than unifying people. And that is very much a sort of Hitlerian strategy and a kind of sort of Nazi strategy. And it means that you can always maintain your own position at the top if you've got parallel command structures and stuff. So the Germans are constantly working against themselves in a way, and that is absolutely the case with the intelligence. And one of the big problems is that Hitler has very set views about things, and once he's got a view, he doesn't like to have his opinions challenged. So if your intelligence picture comes in and challenges what the Führer has said is going to happen, you've got a bit of a problem. And actually, there's plenty of evidence that is picked up to suggest where and pretty much when the Allies are going to land. But it doesn't reach the OKW, which is the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, because it's not passed on. Or if it is passed on, they choose not to give it to Hitler because it's not what he wants to hear. And so key intelligence breakthroughs and key bits of signals intelligence are not acted upon because of that. And that happens in the night before. People have picked up kind of less. They've worked out what the messages to the resistance are, and that has been passed on, but not passed on to the very top. And because Hitler says no, the Allies are going to land in the Pas-de-Calais, and so therefore, if the intelligence comes in and says it's going to arrive in Normandy, well, clearly it's a feint. That's an Allied deception measure. So they might have picked up the information, but they've decided not to act on it. They've decided to treat it in the wrong way, and this clouds the German response all the time. I mean, and another part of that divide and rule, of course, is the Big Fracker that Rommel has with Gerd von Stauffenberg. Gerd von Stauffenberg is the commander of Panzer Group West, which is where is the formation which has the mobile armored units, the Panzer divisions and the one Panzer Grenadier division, whereas Rommel is commander of Army Group B, and one doesn't have the authority over the other. The only person who has the authority over both is von Rundstedt, who is sort of opted out by this point. He's commander of OB West, the overall commander of German forces in the West, and he's basically sort of given up. He thinks that kind of it's all over, and he doesn't want to compromise himself, and doesn't want to kind of make the wrong advice to Hitler. So he just sort of backs out of all this. So eventually Hitler is drawn into this and says, well, actually, the debate is this. That Gerd von Stauffenberg thinks they should spread out the Panzer division so that you're able to deal with every eventuality. And Rommel goes, no, we should take a punt onto where the Allies are most likely to land and mass all the mobile divisions there, which is clearly the right decision to take. Gerd von Stauffenberg has only ever fought on the Eastern Front, whereas Rommel has fought against the Allies and understands their kind of greater air superiority and their Allied air power. So he's in a much better place to make that decision. But Hitler just prevaricates, and he doesn't take Rommel's advice. He follows a middle path and splits up the Panzer divisions and says, actually, ultimately, though, no one can move any Panzer division until I give the authority to. But the problem is that he goes to bed very late and gets up very late, and by which time, on D-Day that he does, it's too late to knock the Allies back into the sea, and no Panzer divisions are allowed to move until 4 o'clock that afternoon. And it's just too late, and it's madness. And so the intelligence picture is constantly being compromised by Hitler himself, because the only time intelligence ever comes together is right at the very top. Whereas in contrast to Allies, we're terribly enamored by the amazing work that the cryptologists do at Bletchley Park, and quite rightly so. But you must see, it's much better to see the work of Bletchley Park as a cog, and that the individual, the sum of these individual parts add up to much more than their individual parts when brought together. And you have the Y service and, all the rest of it, and American intelligence and naval intelligence and air intelligence. And it comes together very quickly in the Allied way, which is why we're much better at it and much more successful at it.
Andrew Flindle has asked a little bit about the US Marine Corps and, obviously their Pacific amphibious doctrine. You mentioned that a little bit earlier about how, they've been conducting amphibious operations for years by this stage. Was there any sort of interchange of ideas from what the Marine Corps were doing in the Pacific and being passed back, or being rather passed across to Europe as well?
Yes and no. So it is shared. It's not shared as effectively as it might be. And of course, I think one of the main reasons is because a sandy atoll in the middle of the Pacific is not southern France or even Sicily or even Normandy. And the differences are just very, very great. And one of the things that the Japanese developed is this idea that you uncontest, you don't contest the invasion. So the invasion is all right, and what you do is you dig yourself deep into a kind of network, a honeycomb of hilltop of tunnels. And so fighting the Japanese is just a very, very different operation. You know, there absolutely aren't any ports, and the kind of infrastructure that's required is a different type of infrastructure to support that. And of course, the U.S. Marine Corps. I mean, you know, you're talking about only a handful of divisions operating in the Pacific, where you're talking about tens of divisions in Europe. So it is. There are lessons, but they're kind of actually fewer than one might imagine.
Fantastic. I think we will sadly have to leave it there. Everybody, please join me in a virtual huge round of applause for James for giving up his time. James is an enormous friend to the National Army Museum, and we're so lucky to be able to share his expertise with all of you. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us. Thank you to Isabel and Nicola, my colleagues, who are running everything in the background and keeping the tech rolling over, and that's great. If your interest has been piqued by everything we've discussed here, don't forget James's book on Normandy 44 is available and comes out in paperback later this year, but is available now if you want to hit that. Please do watch the documentary. If you can see the green bar underneath me here, that will take you straight to where James's brilliant documentary is as well, which has some absolutely beautiful shots of how the battlefields look today, as well as some fantastic analysis of the action too. And finally, I hope you can join us all again next week, where we go backwards through time a little bit. That's the beauty of this job. We can jump through the centuries to talk about the Battle of Waterloo with Waterloo Uncovered, Professor Tony Pollard, and some absolutely fantastic stuff there. Quite literally groundbreaking research that the guys at Waterloo Uncovered are doing into that battle. But James, thank you so much for joining us again. It's always great being able to talk to you. You can see all the comments down the sidebar about how much the audience enjoyed it as well. So thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you again soon, James, and we'll see all of you again soon as well. Enjoy your weekends, everybody. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Yep. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.